Morning, Legacy viewers. Today is a very special group video of Operation Skeptic, more commonly known as Smoke Shell. It was actually Smoke Shell that was the name given to the base. It was actually the code name QFL, but we knew it as Smoke Shell. And we've got a very exciting lineup today. We've got General Dippenaar, who was our commanding officer back then, as Commandant Dippenaar. We've got Tiens Meyer, who was a Puma pilot. We've got Paul Lowe, who was platoon commander of 2-1. We've got Gerard van Rooyen, who was an Eland commander. We've got Peter Williams, a 3-2 recce that was there a few days before us. And we've got Grant Abramser, who I think was Company HQ, Grant?
Yeah. Battalion HQ, 9 Juliet.
Battalion HQ, yeah, okay. So I think if we can start, let's hand over to General Dippenaar, that he can maybe give us a bit of a briefing on the lead up to the operation. Sorry, I've got a few people wanting to join.
Yes, Andrew and everybody present. Good morning to you all. It's a privilege for me to share with you a few ideas or happenings of the past. I would like to start right in the beginning of something that touches me very, very closely. I can remember in 1978, I was the personal staff officer of Chief of the Army, at that time, General Constant Viljoen. And he was busy with inspection of the commando units in the Eastern Cape when we were flying from one unit to the other. When he called me in the flight and he says to me, Dibbies, how would you react if I appoint you as the battalion commander, mechanized battalion commander in the operational area? Well, that was to me the best words that I've ever heard. And on 5 January 1979, that's 45 years ago, I reported to Oshakati, to Oshakati, with my whole family. And in Oshakati, about the new unit, there was absolutely nothing. Nobody knew about it. And there was only one office that I could occupy with no communication. And the next moment I realized, you better move to Grootfontein, which I did. And arriving in Grootfontein, there was the vehicles and the equipment arriving day after day. And I was sort of overwhelmed by the amount of hardware arriving. And everybody was saying, now, what should we do? And that's the way I eventually moved to Oshivelo. And in the bush, about 30 kilometers of the gate, from the gate, I ended up in this bushy area, and it was later called Omatea. And Omatea means camel tree. And that's how 6-1 started from the early days. Something special to remember, and I can recall the names of all the people still involved, and it's so great to see one of my great colleagues here, Paul Lowe. It's lekker om jou te sien, Buddha. And I know there's a lot of other guys looking and being wanted to be here, but they can't. So to everybody, yes, that's the starting point. And from there on, the equipment arrived at Omatea, and bits and pieces, we started to build the unit. Items that I will never forget is the routine that we had. From wake up in the morning till 10, it was time to sort out your personal items. From 10 to 2, it was training. And in the sun and making up the vehicles and maintaining them. And then in the afternoon, it was time to work on the base and start to build the base. And there was absolutely nothing else than a bush world where we started to build the base. And that was the beginning. From then on, it is information about terrorists, information about targets, and every time the leader group would gather in the operational tent and be briefed on what the next moment's activity would be. And I think that's the way it started, and it will be interesting to hear from instance Paul Lowe, how he experienced his arrival there, what was on the ground. Because to me, Smoke Shell was the very first target, and nothing was 100% prepared yet when we started with Smoke Shell. But guys who would know what it was like is guys like Paul Lowe and Henny, HP, they will be able to tell you what the situation was then.
If I may, thank you, General. Yeah, when we arrived, look, we took over the Oman, and Abramson you can recall that they were there already a year before the leader group arrived. So we got off the aeroplane in Grootfontein, and yeah, we were already start hunting terrorists because we thought they were under every bush and tree. But it wasn't like that. And the next day, I believe it was late in December, 1979. The next day we went to Omatia via the Samels and the Kwefuels. And as we arrived there, I believe the base was already in such a state that you could see it's a military base. I think all the tents were pitched, and all the tents had. Well, I can't remember the tents of the troops and those to the lines of the different units, but I can recall that the officers and NCO's tents had cement on the floor. So it was already a base that looked like something military, and no, it was a good experience to get into a base that big in the bush, and I think everything was well laid out, and it looked good. I think Peter and Grant Abramson and the other guys that was there already. I think Andrew, you guys, you were a part of building the base. I know that at the end of 1980, I can't remember precisely the date when they started building the swimming pool, but that was a luxury. That was a nice to have. I think that wasn't very a serious part of the construction of the base.
Paul, if I can just come in there. Is it all right? Andrew, can I say what I say?
Yeah, sure, Grant. Go for it.
I do remember, and Paul, I agree with you. When we got to hello HP, no sin. When we got to Omatia, I think everything was there, General. You had laid out the base perfectly. Even the floors of the normal troops, the 10 floors were actually physically beaten down, so they were pretty stiff and pretty hard. Getting to the idea of the Manasi and everything like that, it was like we were walking into a base as well developed and well set as one side. Paul, just to answer the question on the pool, Battalion HQ with I think the Corporal Smith and General Dippenaar will know more about it. Corporal Smith, we took the initiative to build a pool for the troops that followed us. And I think we started it just after Smoke Shell, and the 18 of us dug that pool and bent those rebars and mixed that concrete by hand. And I think on the 7th of December, we started filling that pool up, General. And on the 8th of December, 1980, we were going to leave. And we as Battalion HQ members went down to that pool and thought, you know, come hell or high water, we are going to swim in that pool. And I think by that time, there was only 3 foot of water in the pool. So we all just sort of sat in the pool. And my twin brother Brent, still engraved on the right-hand bottom corner. If you recall, there was a big diving platform. The right-hand bottom corner, which I visited in 2000 or 2010, I went back there, and I actually took a photo of the engraving where he wrote in the concrete, "O Manor Battalion HQ 7980," still there today. I don't know if it is. I haven't been there since then. But yeah, that's with regards to the pool. But I must compliment you, General, that the base was practically all set up by the time Alpha Company and Bravo Company arrived with the Panzers and etc. And that even the parade ground was graded smoothly. It was a phenomenal base. Thanks for that.
Okay, can I just fill in on the pool for a moment? At the beginning, everybody was busy getting the formation operational. So it was servicing vehicles and getting them to work. But there was a hell of a frustration by the troops as well, because there was no recreational activities. And it was from day to night. And eventually, the idea of a pool came up, and that pool was built by the engineers in a maximum time to have it finished. And the joy that the troops get from that pool cannot be told over again. It was a hell of a great move for everybody.
Thanks.
But yes, other than that, the activities around the base was the most important thing, to get all the tents working, to get the kitchen working, and especially the light workshop troop. I still have contact with Dupi, who stays in Worcester, who was the kingpin in organizing the light workshop troop. For those of you who remember the hard work that they've done, it's something remarkable.
Yeah.
Thanks, Dippy. Could you maybe just give us some sort of information? Obviously, at some point in time, you were now told we're going to launch this attack into southern Angola and attack the base at Smoke Shell. What changed, and what sort of special things happened, extra training, etc.? Maybe if you could just give us some info on that.
Yeah, certainly. I think the most important thing is what were the focus at the time. Because at 6-1 base, it was building a base and get the troops operational. From an outside point of view, there was terrorists moving in all the time. In fact, terrorists moved through nearby the base to the Etosha. They were moving to Etosha. That was another threat touching on the headquarters. But then the most important thing was the information that we got. Because from Shakati, where all the intelligence was grouped, they keep on giving us information about terrorists entering the area. And I can recall that we were still busy building the base when the terrorists entered the farming area, and they killed the Ruud family and Friedrich family. And so everything from the 6-1 mechanized force had to stop and redeploy to capture and eliminate the terrorists that was in the area, which was done successfully. So that is one of the outstanding points of 6-1. They could do operations by foot to eliminate the terrorists, and at the same time build a base. And thirdly, and that is the most important one, use their equipment and make sure that the equipment is operational for use for its main role of mechanized force. So on a daily basis, there was effort made to teach the guys how to operate their guns, and small exercises training exercises was carried out on a weekly basis to make sure that everybody knows what to do. And as the information of terrorist activities grew, the preparation of our force was priority. And that's, I can compliment everybody, which was Powell Lowe was platoon commander, and so was many others, for the excellent work that they have done to get the troops ready and prepared. So scenarios were pictured for the training of a force that's of an enemy force in the area, and how to move and how to deploy for attack. So that was one of the activities, and I think even HP can tell us what he did during the training phase of preparing for operations.
Hallo, ja, ek het inkom daar môre.
Môre HP. Ons hoor jou.
Wel, het is 'n bietjie laat, maar het is maar stadig. Hoor jy? Ja, nee, nou generaal, weet jy, ek kom net daar by die basis, kan ek net iets aanhef daar. 6-1, die dag toe ons in konvooi gestaan het, ons het my ratel iets goed gewees met sy engine, en ons het hom getrek, en ons wil ander ratel kry, maar ons het ander engine ingesit. En ek glo nie, dit was 20 minute later, die toekomst, kan ons weer aanval. Toe Paul was hy, dit dalk kan onthou, ja, en maar die opleiding wat betref is, ja, ek sal sê as ek nou terugdink, dan dink ek mens aan die mag wat daar gestel is deur leiers, was net fantasties geweest, en ons wat uit verskillende groepe uitkom en groeperinge uitkom en verskillende agtergrondtotale het op daai stadium toen by 6-1 kom het ons net gejal en regtig waar ek kan nie slecht praat van een nou wat saam met my daar was die dit is en almal het hulle harte gegee vir sy Babylons. So dit was vir my en nog tot vandag toe is dit vir my die kern van wat ons deurgegaan het en hoe ons dit deurgegaan het. Ek glo nie ons sal eers miskien lewendig daar uitgekom het as nie was vir die opleiding van alle kante af, van medics, van die enige ou wat betrokke was daar, die groep wat vir ons ondersteuningsgroep was dit fantasties geweest. En ja, as 'n mens nou, ek 2 jaar terug op die basis was, dan kom die flitse deur wat ou gesien het daar, en ja, dit is 'n diep verligtende hartseer wat 'n mens kry, is om te sien, hier was ons spore gewees, en hierso is baie lewens gevat, en baie gegee. Jy weet, ek kan praat van toe ons daar was, het het vir my gegaan oor my en die ou wat teen my geveg. Dit is absoluut om te dink, hy was ook 'n mens, hy het ook kinders gehad, hy het ook ouers gehad, so het ek ook gehad, en ja, dit is net, ons was die beste opgeleid geweest van die macht op daai stadium. Dat ek sê, met die bietjie wat ons gehad het, 4 ratels in daai basis, en kan ek nie veel vertel, het ons uit baie goed gedoen. Ek sal maar weer opkom later.
Andrew, if I may come in here, I want to reiterate the point what HP just said and what General Dippie said as well. You know, there's a lot been written and a lot been said about all the attacks in Angola by 6-1, and especially of Smoke Shell. You quite often hear in smaller groups, yeah, the people didn't know, or the troops didn't really know what happened and what should be done, and what was the orders very specific. But what I can tell without any regrets, that the orders we had 3 months, it started 3 months before June. The order of the officers and NCOs that we had was to the detail. I mean, we knew everything that we should do, must do, and there was no two ways about it. And I recall that once, twice, 3 times a week, I would go to the troops and sit in the tent and gather all the section leaders and the section 2 IBs and the drivers and the gunners and everybody that wanted to. I mean, the troops could have slept or they could have boned their boots or whatever the case may be. But we went through the orders and we made sure that everybody knew what is the route, what should we do, how should we drive, where should we turn, where should we wait, and for what to wait. And I believe even afterwards, I had a scuffle with old Witko Barnhorst about the orders. And I said to him, you know, the orders were given. It was there. It was written. We can even have a look at it today. I believe it's unclassified. So the orders, I believe, was very detailed orders. As we got trained as officers through Major Ep van Lille, those orders were in detail. And we discussed it on numerous occasions. So that is the point that I want to make clear. I think everybody should have known what they should do. Drawing rattle engines and looking after the vehicles. That was also one of those things that I remember with the training, that there was a lot of fires that started in the engine compartment of the rattles due to leaves and stuff that fell in there. And I believe that it was a week before the 10th of June, we drew all the 2 companies' rattles were drawn, the engine compartments were cleaned, and they were put back again. And that was happening a week before a major op, and everything was fine. I believe there were 1 or 2 rattles that wasn't working well. But to do that, and I think we worked through nights to help the drivers and the gunners to prepare the vehicles. That I can remember very, very well.
Just to add on what Paul has just said, during the routine of the base and the troops that are preparing the vehicles, the intelligence staff was very, very active. And they were reporting from Sector 10 in Oshakati, reporting to Omatia at the base. And daily we sat around a table and looked at what is the information that we got about the enemy. And this is, for me, the crux of the attack also. Because intelligence came up and says there's about 600 terrorists in a particular area. The area was about 120 kilometers across the Angola-Namibian border. And it was next to a very indication of a river. And what they could tell us is that the enemy there is not prepared with any heavy armament. There's no armored cars, there's no guns. All that they can report was it was soldiers dug into slit trenches for 1 or 2 men. And that was a very, very big concern with me in particular, because the orders to the troops would be then prepared to attack the base and prepared to find the enemy in slit trenches, 1 or 2. There was no top cover, no dug-in trenches, and no armament. So you can imagine if that is a scenario of what the preparation would have been and was at the time for the troops. It was a matter is go with your rattle and you can prepare to fight from your vehicle, and the enemy would be in slit trenches. So be on the lookout for slit trenches, and there's no overhead cover and so forth. And I question that scenario or the picture of the enemy repeatedly, because that makes a huge difference in the manner that we're going to do the attack. And the last orders that I gave to the soldiers was that, look, there's about 600 enemy. They are not dug in. They are not. There's no weapons, big weapons or tanks or guns. That's our target. Let's go for it.
General, Andrew, can I just come in here? It's been
Sure.
interesting to hear on that scenario with General saying, that he was said that there's only soldiers in slit trenches, etc., etc. We now know after the fact, hindsight is an exact science. But if I can ask Peter and Tiens whether they had any active role in wrecking or doing overflights of the smoke shell base, and whether they picked up anything that could reiterate what Commandant Dippener has just told us, if they don't mind giving their input.
Grant, yeah, I'm going to actually ask Peter to speak next, so he can incorporate that question into his just from my side, and we always knew of the Air Force involvement, but I only found out fairly recently of the involvement of 3-2 Battalion Recce's. And Peter Williams was lieutenant with the 3-2 Recce's for, I think, about a week before we actually attacked Smoke Shell Base. So, Peter, maybe if you could give us some info from that side. Peter?
Okay, there I am. Can you hear me now?
There we go. Okay, thanks.
Okay, great. I wasn't in the recce wing at that stage. The recce wing was actually involved with a different operation at the stage. They were doing an operation called Operation Savati. So they were all involved with that operation. And I was with Delta Company, and we were part of 5-4 Battalion's group. And we were two companies. We were Delta and Gulf Company. And we were basically had to cross over and secure the Hague area in Lemba. So we left on the 25th of May and we moved forward. And we had 4 contacts along the route, and we lost about 4 men. 1 went missing. And what we could tell was that the enemy was very, very well organized. We had our platoon commander, Pierre van der Walt, was shot through the heart, and he was shot with a Dragunov, and we presumed that it was a Cuban, because they took all the leader group members out, a sergeant as well. And previously, we'd been working the last 6 months in the shallow area, and we'd taken a town called Ched as well in March already. And we were reporting that there was lots of movement, that there was vehicle movement, and we saw a lot of activity taking place in the area. And so our job was just to basically go in and secure the route all the way up to Malemba, and then form the Hague. And then from there, we were supposed to be used as helicopter airborne troops to do stopper groups and so on. But as you might know, that the fuel for the helicopters didn't arrive at the Hague. I still don't know what the reason for that was. But the enemy that we encountered was very well organized. It was SWAPO, most definitely. And we were surprised at their discipline and well organized, because previously to that, we hadn't worked with well organized and well trained troops. So that was the foreboding part to the beginning of OBSkeptic for us.
Thanks, Peter. All right. Yeah. Grant, does that sort of give you some information on that?
Yeah, it's very interesting. Thanks, Peter. Because we have understanding, and Paul could also second me on this one, because when we drove through the base or our attack formation, we actually drove straight through where we were supposed to, and then did a 180, and then came back, and then we got thumped by 23 mils 14.5s and a well-organized, like, basic ambush. They took 4 Rattles out within a couple of minutes. So, thanks for that, Peter. I mean, so the information you just gave me enlightened the fact that we weren't going to be facing Mickey Mouse troops. We were going to face well-seasoned SWAPO veterans with good leadership skills. And and that's what we fundamentally did. It would be interesting to hear what Tian says as well, because from an overview and a flight over, and I don't know if Paul agrees with me, that we did go through the target area, did a 180, came through, came back, and then as ek gaan dit nou net soos 'n Engelsman sê, the shit hit the fan. And that was it. And it was established that they were really waiting for us at that stage. So the intelligence was spot on for 6-1, coming to attack them. Thanks, Peter.
Okay, Andrew, I will come quickly in here. Okay, the orders were, as I said, the orders were very in detail. But about a month, 3 weeks before the time, there was some sort of air photos that we studied. I remember one night, and the intelligence said to us that we had to be on the lookout for, it seems like, some sort of anti-aircraft targets. And I can remember they said that it looked like on the photos that there were 3 on the northern side of the target area, and then some 3 or 4 in the middle, and maybe 2 on the southern side, on the southwestern side of the target area. So we were on the lookout for them. But as I also mentioned in previous stories that I wrote, when we and I agree with you there, Brent, that we went through from where we got the opdracht laat waai, from that road, that north-south road, to the target area. The Mossie couldn't bring us onto the target because the flak in the air was so thick, he couldn't see what's going on the ground. So there was definitely anti-aircraft. So we missed the target, and I believed at that stage, my company HQ were having their own troubles, and the other platoons as well. And when I arrived at the riverbed, I assumed that we missed the target. So what I did was I lined the 4 vehicles up, and we drove in a single file down the riverbed about 300 meters, and then we turned east again. And as I said previously, at that stage, I gave the order to step out, but I immediately changed it because I wasn't sure what was on the other side. Rather go over here in the Rattles than sending troops over there, without any backing. So as we drove over there, we drove right into the middle of as we call it, target area 11. But I also said in one of the discussions, my discussion with the previous one, Andrew, that they were really dug in good. We could have seen that, but their arcs of fire were mainly in towards the western side, and all of a sudden we drove from the eastern. Oh no, we were driving from the western side into the Doelwit, but their arcs of fire was to the west. So they were expecting us an attack from the eastern side. So that is my conclusion is that is why they only got to shot out the Rattles when we were in close range. They would have hit us with those anti-aircraft guns at 300, 400, 500 meters if we had attacked them from the eastern side, because there were a lot of trees, but the bushes were off. The bushes were I think they've maybe cut them, or I don't know. No. But all of a sudden we were right in the middle of the base, and I mean HB can recall our Rattle was shot out. We were right next to that cannon, 20 meters, I would say. Charlie vehicle was about 30, 40 meters from the 23, And the same with the Alpha vehicle with Lawrence and his section. They were like 40 meters from those cannons, so it was very close range. So yeah, I mean, as Major Ep van Lille always told us, you can plan and you can give orders, and you can be on the top of your game. But when the first bullet is shot, then everything is dear mekaar.
That's true.
Very.
I'm going to ask Gerard van
Okay,
Rooyen to come.
just
Okay, carry on, please. Yeah.
no. I just wanted to say to add on what Paul has mentioned and described. There was 3 forces going in simultaneously. The one was Jakes Jacobs, and he was on the far north. And then it was Paul Fouchier, which was in the middle. And then on the left-hand side, from a own forces point of view, the third one was where Paul Lowell was in. And the first one from Jakes on the far north, he reported no enemy. They absconded and left a lot of equipment behind. But that's the very first time that we learned about the dug-in Loopgraven, because it was like houses that they built underground, but you couldn't see a thing from the top. So everything that you met from the enemy's point of view, it was a surprise, because it wasn't indicated on a map or anything. And then Paul Fouchier, he was in the middle. They struck a little bit of resistance. And then on the far south, it was Paul Low and his combat team, who he really hit the target of Omatia, of a smoke shell. And that's where all the casualties also came from. Just to put that in perspective.
Thanks, Dippies.
Sorry, one other thing is what concerned me as a commander was the use of the Air Force, because before we attacked that morning, the Air Force made an airstrike on the base. And my question was, what were they striking? Because the picture was not very clear on what the target for the Air Force was. So what effect was expected with the attack of the Air Force? Of course, it might surprise. It helped us to make a surprise with our attack. But at the time, from a intelligence point of view, it was not clear what the target was for the Air Force. Just as a remark from the Air Force.
Thanks, Dippies. I'm going to ask Gerard van Rooyen to come in now. Gerard was the commander, I think, of the lead Eland 90. Maybe Gerard, you can just give us a bit of info from the Eland side of things.
Good morning. Yes, my name is Gerard van Rooyen. I was the troop commander for 3-5, fighting team 3 with Jakes Jacobs, and I actually led the whole fighting group from Molemba up to the what is Opstelplekke, right to the east of the target. And then when we turned left, there were 3 roads. The northernmost road, I actually it was densely, it was open, and then you went into a bush type of thing. We set up in a line abreast, and we moved through the bushes. And then when we got to we zeroed our trip meters, so we actually knew exactly where the outskirts of the complexes were, and it opened up a bit. And as we moved in, we expected the intelligence given to us was the most dangerous weapons were the B10 recoilless cannons and the RPGs. They did talk about anti-aircraft guns, but I don't think at the time people thought they were going to be used in the ground, as ground weapons as well. So as this, all these trees opened up and I could see in front of me, I stopped. We couldn't see anything. I got out of the car, I stood halfway up and I looked around. And then as I looked to my left, 3 meters from me was a trench, as General Dippenaar just said. And I looked into the mouth of this thing. And luckily for me and for us, there were cobwebs in this thing. So it was an abandoned trench that was there where people died before. And I didn't even see it. We could have driven into it, or actually there could have been someone in that and they would have had a perfect target shot on me from within 3 meters. Luckily, that didn't happen. Yeah, and then we went through the complex to the western side, and we inspected the whole area, and we couldn't find anything. And because I was on the troop commanders and I had extra radios, I tuned into the General Dippenaar's Zero Net. And as I switched over, the first thing I heard is, there's a lot of guys dead. And I tell you what, the shock. At that moment, I realized this is not going to be a picnic. And yeah, then we were called, because we moved through, and we were in rondom verdediging at the time. We were summoned to the south to come and help and clean up some other sections of the target. I think if you were also in A company, Andrew, if I remember correctly, and we went down and we had to clean up a Mahango field with another 2, I think, 14.5s on it, and we lined up. But this was actually a perfectly executed by the book. We lined up the 12 armored cars in front with one of your platoons, I don't know which one, at the back of us, and we fought through the target, took out the anti-aircraft guns, which were manned at the time. We killed the guys on the weapons, and some people jumped out of the ground. I didn't even realize what was going on. There was no one in front of me. Then suddenly there were 3 guys running in front of us. So, which means they were hiding under the ground in those bunkers. And as we approached, they decided to run away, get out from under the ground. And yeah, that's how we ended up there having a big fight.
Gerard, I don't know if, sorry, man. I'm sitting in Cape Town now. I stay in Auckland, but I've just visited Cape Town, and I had a surprise reunion with Michael Bond and Andre Upton and Rutte and the guys. And Bond was saying that through that maize field where you guys did the cleaning up, and the 14.5s, when the helicopter Geers Passon landed to take the Casevacs out, there was, at a certain stage, I think old Keith Sabata also took one of those 14.5s out. It was in the open, and that was with one of the Rattle 90s. So, and Mike also said an interesting thing, that I don't know if one of your vehicles broke down, and Dippies actually said to Mike, kry 'n touwtjie op daai voertuig so vinnig soos wat jy kan. And Mike just jumped out the vehicle with bullets flying around, and he got to the back of the vehicle, and I remember Jooste, which I think Commandant Dipper will know, is the smallest guy in the vehicle, about 7 foot bloody tall and 350 pounds. He kept the back hatch closed so Michael Bond couldn't get the tow hitch on, so he was banging on the back of the Rattle, and Jooste had to open the back hitch. Meanwhile, old Dippies was shouting, "Kry die donderse ding op," so that we can pull that 90 mil out. I don't think you remember, or you do remember, but he said he just hitched it on and it was facing backwards, and the poor oak bounced wherever they went, because the Rattles obviously bigger tracks than that, but that was one of the nice stories of it.
Yeah, if I can come in, I just want to clear up something. The story where I said we fought through the Mahangu field, that was just the first part of it. Then after that, in the evening, we withdrew, and General can back me up here. And I was again at the back of this, all the vehicles. And my last vehicle also fell into a bunker, into a trench, and we had to pull it out ourselves. And whilst he was being pulled out, there was single shots fired from a 14.5 somewhere. I think the automatic mechanism must have jammed up, and the guy was firing one shot at a time, low over the car in the dusk, so I could see the tracer going 2-3 feet above the car. And my troop sergeant, who was actually recovering the Charlie car, he didn't even realize that. In any case, so we got out of there. Then we were at the back of this line that went down south. And then about when it was just turning dark, we ran into a huge ambush. And that is where the story that you are telling now comes in. By then, certain of the armored cars, because of the heavy sand, had run out of fuel. And I know, I think it was Andrew Loubser that told us that they had to, in that ambush, within the ambush, big fight, just tracers flying all over. I mean, this was a very well executed ambush, although the SWAPO guys never hit any of us, or they barely hit any of us. The guys had to jump out and hook the armored car, one of them. And
Gerard,
yes.
Oh, sorry, man. You know, Andrew Loubser was also at this reunion on Saturday last week, and he actually told me this particular story that my twin brother Brent, and Dippies knows that I'm an ugly twin as well. So that my twin brother drove the rattle towards your guy's car, did like a handbrake turn, reversed the car, and within seconds Jennings was out there, put in the bloody tow bar on the car, and they were moving within minutes. And you know, coming from Andrew Loubser, it was quite pertinent that you now mention that story as well. It was quite funny as well. You know, I could just imagine the naughty cars cucking themselves. So
the naughty cars didn't cuck themselves. Let me just tell you that.
Gerard, I'm baiting you. Don't worry. It's always a competition between
all that I can add to the conversation is, and what description of the fight was, there were so many shots flying around that you were not very sure which ones is your own or which ones are from the enemy, especially the late afternoon. And I think that is one of the experiences of a soldier, being in a contact situation, knowing that somebody is firing, but you don't know who's firing at whom. And that was one of the lessons for that fight. And then later that afternoon, when we went into a laager for safety, it was the information shared by the troops, telling them what they experienced and what worried them, what threatened them, and give a bit of support to one another to be ready for the next phase of the attack.
Kom Dippies, ek wil daar aansluit by oom. Jy weet, let me try and do it in English again. I'm from the Free State. We only do it in self-defense. But you know what? You can tell people what happened, but I think we haven't realized what was happening around. I mean, when we load HP into a rattle, when we regrouped on the target area, there were always shots fired and people lying around. I always say to guys, and even the reckies, They did make war. They kill 1, 2, 3, 10 guys here and 2 guys there. But there were people lying all over the show. It looked like those American movies. And you only realize that afterwards. And for me, not to talk about it for 28 years. And when after 28 years meeting HP, talking to HP again, I think then you realize, and I always say there's the bigger power that saved us that day. Unfortunately, there was this guys that was, but then I also believe the good die young, and we guys still have to do a job on this planet, and describing the whole situation with what has been done, what the guys were doing under heavy fire. It's crazy.
On that point, I think I would like to confront my friend HP to tell us his experience in a nutshell, because if there's somebody that I know that can tell the truth of battle, then it is HP, because he experienced everything from getting into a vehicle safely and getting out of the vehicle and having been reported as dead. That's the mistake that I made. The information that I got was that this soldier was shot and he is dead. And here he is 45 years afterwards. My friend, HP, jy is 'n ou eyster, my maat.
Ja, baie dankie. Weet eisters roes ook maar. So ja, ons het dit was vir my ook maar 'n leerskoor elke sekond van die ops gewees. Ja, ons het soos wat Paul gesê het, ons het oor 'n hoogtekie gekom, stil gestaan en toe ons vorentoe beweeg. Dit was nie, ek sal nie sê, mens kan nou nie tyd nou onthou of vaslê presies nie, maar dit was maar 'n sekond of 2 wat soos 'n ewigheidsgevoel het. Toe ek agterkom die voertuig brand, het ek die deure oopgemaak. Gelukkig, ek is nie bewuslik, weet aan die linkerkant waar 'n loopsher dood is, daai deur was oop gewees, ek omgekyk het, en op daai stadium was die vuur die hitte so geweldig, die ammunisie begin afgaan het. Ek wou by my huis uit, maar toes die 20 mal is toe nou reg oor my huis gewees. Ek is toe in die toring in, en die loop weggedraai en terug, en ja, mens weet hoe, kan nie presies sê hoe vinnig is ek daar uit nie, maar ek weet ek het uitgegaan en ek het in dekking gegaan. Daarna het ek gesien, dit is chaos, absoluut chaos op die grond, en ek het maar geprobeer wat Paul, wat ek kon ons sien, en probeer doen, en probeer volg wat hy sê. Op daai stadium het ek opgestaan en probeer gaan, ek het nie 'n wapen gehad nie, maar ja, mens dink, jy kan iets doen, jy weet, en ek het daai een, dit is gesien, die aircraft gun, en toe ek opstaan, toe ek die slag, en ja, van daai tyd af wat ek die slag voel het, tot as, waar ek agterkom het, dat hulle is besig om my in die helikopter te laai, ons wat nou weg was, het ons gedink, ratel het baie pypies en draadjies voor, maar ja, toe sien ek die drade, die goed van die helikopter, toe besef ek, hier gaan nou iets anders doen my aan, en weet julle, dit is een ding wat ek dink wat die ons weer gesien het, is dat ons nie kan recall, jy weet, kan beskryf na die tyd nie, jy kan dit ook nie onthou nie. So ek dink dit is wat vir my deurslag gegee het, is maar Ek is 'n gelowige en absoluut het ek dink meeste van ons sal Psalm 23 ken. Dit was my laaste psalm wat ek gelees het en tot vandag toe is dit vir my belangrike ene. En besef dat ons wesens op aarde is die gesigte doel. Die doel is nie om te doen wat deesdae gebeur in die lewens nie. Ek dink ons het 'n moeiliker situasie as daai tydse oorlog wat in ons land aangaan. So ja, vir my is dit ek is trots, ek het vir my land geveg. Ek het die beste probeer doen wat ek kon. Hopelik was dit die regte ding wat ek gedoen het. Ja, dit gebeur so vinnig, mense nie. Maar ja, dit is maar kort en lank. Dankie.
Ons waardeer dit, HP. Dit is wonderlik om van jou te hoor. Well done.
Dankie, Dips.
Generaal?
Ek luister.
Yeah, I see you got that picture, that famous picture sitting behind you of I think Al Willem Steenkamp took that photograph, and that's exactly what HP is chatting about. Because, and just to I understand what HP is going through, because it was Dries Medic and myself that picked HP up off the ground and put him in our rattle, and Doc Heyman and Tubes did a fantastic job, and that I'd spoken before. And I think we had about 8 people in our rattle that we assisted to the Kazakhstan area. And the photograph, the interesting photograph is that you sitting in front of was when we were moving back from the chopper after we'd loaded those 8 guys. And I never forget the time when we walk into that, or running with HP on the stretcher with Steve the toy next to me holding the drips up, with I think it was Michael Bond behind in the stretcher, and we go in there, and I said to Steve the toy, I said, Steve, this isn't a good time for you to trip, my boy. This, I must put your asthma behind you, and you must run to that helicopter. And when we loaded HP onto that helicopter, HP, ek kan vir jou sê, what we said when we loaded, and I think if I remember, maybe Tiens can help me, but Geers Besson was the pilot on that day, I don't know. I did meet him years ago. But when we loaded HP on that helicopter, we looked down and we said, that might be the last time we see HP. But through the will of God, let's hope he lives. And we went back to the rattle, knowing full well that we've done everything that we could, possibly, to give him the best chance that we had of survival. And General, I must say, and Paul, and I've reiterated it with Andrew, if it wasn't for you guys' leadership group training that we had in all our various units, etc., and the assistance we had from logistics, from the medics, from the postal clock to the food, the ammunition, etc. I think if it wasn't for the excellent training that we received, we would have taken a lot more casualties that day, General. And especially looking at that helicopter behind you, I don't know if Tiens can add to it, but that pilot landed.
Now it's off air. Andrew?
Okay. Grant, you can speak.
Andrew?
He landed under severe and intense fire, and if it wasn't for his heroic deeds, we would have lost a lot as well.
Thank you very much, Grant.
Yeah.
Andrew, tell us your story.
Excuse me?
Tell us your experience during that fight.
Sorry,
I can. Yeah,
interrupted my call. No, the story was exactly, we followed Polo into the Dulbert. We saw the rattles that were taken out, General, and I tell you, we just positioned ourselves directly and as close to the fire zone or the contact area as possible, so that we could get into a position where we could actually deliver the best medical treatment that we could in the shortest possible time. I must admit that Doc Heyman, Dries, the medic, I tried to contact him for the last 45 years. I wish I could get him in the hands, but I can't find him, Dries de Beer. The two of them and my crew, I was just the gunner commander of the vehicle. But the three guys that I had there, they performed like a well-oiled and professional team. I mean, I've never seen a rattle full of blood like that. I've never seen guys that were that severely injured. When we picked HP Ferreira up, HP Campia said, when we picked him up, we could look through his body. Dippies, when we picked him up by the legs and by the arms, we could. I said to Dries, Dries, this like shattered. I mean, he's in half. We put him in the rattle. Doc Heyman just got to work. We worked on all the guys there. My vehicle didn't have a weapon. The transporter of my Browning had broken. I didn't realize that, and I think that saved my life because I wasn't giving fire, returning fire to the opposition and to the enemy. And when we moved out of that area, Steve du Toit positioned the rattle next to HP's rattle. And I remember Pip Warner was on the far side of the rattle, and we tried to get hold of him. This is the biggest regret we've got, Dippies, is that as much as we tried to get to old Pip Warner on that side of the rattle, as soon as we walked out of the shelter of their vehicle, we took severe and intense fire. So we made the decision. We've got 8 in our rattle. Let's get them to the Kazovac area, and we try and save these 8 guys, because otherwise we're going to lose all of them. And just to thankfully, through our training, following the leadership group and the orders that you were given on the radio, I think at one stage someone had jammed the radio. His Pressel was in, and we couldn't get comms, etc., etc. But we managed to get to the Kazovac area where that photograph portrays the success of us at 9 Juliet 1, saving those 8 guys' lives. That was my experience, but it was intense. It was really intense.
Thanks, Grant. I think just to put things in perspective, B Company Platoon 1, which would have been 43 men, 12 were killed, and I think 17 Kazovac that day. And maybe it's a good time for us to bring Tiens Meyer in. Tiens was a Puma pilot and would have been involved in the Kazovacs, etc. Tiens, maybe if you can come in and give us some info from your side.
Andrew, thank you very much. I appreciate that I can give a little bit of information as to what I can remember. And I just want to give a little bit overview on what I look at my logbook. I was positioned basically to Ondangwa around about the 6th, 7th of June. And the briefing that we got was basically that we would give support in trooping, supplies, gas evacuation and things like that. I did mention earlier during the conversation that I suspect that picture was taken of me. That's behind the general with that Puma there. Unfortunately, I don't recall, and I know that we did Kazovacs, and it's difficult to say, yes, it was me, but I recall something like that. And if that was the case, that I did do the Kazovac that day, I'm glad that I could be assistance in helping someone whose life saved today. There was a lot of flying on the helicopter side. We were basically supporting wherever we could. When the base was attacked, probably it was done by the Buccaneers and the Mirages initially, and then from your side, the ground troops were doing the fighting, if I put it that way. And having a look at my logbook on dates and stuff like that, I was flying with George Miller at the time, and I want to come in to say from Gerard's side and Grant's side, after Savati, which was about the 21st of May, we were then positioned over for the Skeptic smoke shell side, and on just support trooping supplies, CASEVACs. That was the part that we did. I want to also mention something which happened during close to the target site. And we were either flying 2 or 4 or 6 or whatever Pumas. I think we were tasked to be a 10 Puma support at the time. One of our guys landed quite hard where there were people, and there was a SAML there as well. And unfortunately, when they landed and they wanted to take off, the tail of the Puma had actually severed, if I put it that way, and the drive shaft pulled out of the thing. They spun around, they realized the tail had fallen off, and in fact, we were then tasked to go and fetch another tail and bring it into the area. And I've got a picture here. I'm going to just try and show it on the side where the Puma's tail was hanging across in the Puma. We went to Ondangwa to fetch one, and on the SAML 40, there were sandbags. We loaded the new tail boom onto there, and there are 80 bolts inside the tail boom, and only one guy can get into the tail and undo that. Now, I might be telling a long story, but the support that we had from the ground troops side was to take the SAML and bring it into the Puma and then just lift it up. And the one guy that's inside had to fix up the 80 bolts again. And from the time they started loosening the bolts until they started the Puma, it was 2 hours 15.
Oh.
And the Puma flew out with us. Now, that support from the ground guy's side was excellent. And coming in on that CASEVAC side, as I say, unfortunately, I don't recall exactly, but I know we did quite a lot of CASEVACs, and thereafter, from the helicopter side, a lot of armament in crates were given for us to fly out back to Ondangwa. And I know at one stage we were 6 Pumas going in and out like 4, 5, 6 hours a day, just flying equipment out back to base. And I know George and myself, and I was actually recalling the story a while ago, I remember we were heavy going out, and because it's a confined area, you have to lift off and then go high above the trees before you can move forward. And George ran out of power, and we had to get back into the LZ, and we nearly crashed the Puma there.
Wow.
But from supporting where you people brought in the CASEVACs to us in a very professional way, we never had an incident where guys were running underneath the tail of the helicopters or anything like this. Was absolutely just a thing that made our hearts feel good. So that's what I can say from my side.
I trust that fixing of the tail was the engineer fixing those bolts and everything, and not one of the ground crew. I'm just in a joke.
We had an engineer. I mean, as I say, we flew in 2 engineers from Ondangwa with a tail boom, with the tools and everything. So now I must say, in that what happened, it took us 2 hours 15. We had the SAML to give us that support to drive and just pick it up and hold it. Another incident which happened, I think probably in it was Ops Butterfly or Daisy or something, where another guy landed next to me and the tail off because of a maintenance problem. And in fact, Zico and myself went to Ondangwa because we had the experience bringing the tail boom, and we brought it back. And the ground troops that we dropped in the LZ with, and I mentioned something else with Daisy, we picked up that tail boom, and we then managed to do it in 1 hour 45. So from the
Excellent.
ground troop side, the absolute support that was significant.
If I may come in again here, Andrew, I just have this story about choppers, and then I think I've spoken a lot. That night we slept on the target area. We were bombarded by our own forces throughout the night, and the next morning, before first light, we moved out. But with us was Chris Raats, which was badly wounded, and he couldn't walk, so we carried him out, and we were walking about, say, 12 odd kilometers, and all of a sudden there was this gunships in the air, and I can't remember. I believe it was 10. I'm not sure. Maybe Tians, you can tell us how many gunships took part in Smoke Shell, but I asked them to let one come down and sit and to casevac Chris, because he was hindering our movement. And after some motivation and discussion, one of the Alouettes, I think we only had orange smoke, so we threw orange smoke, and the one came and he sat down, and we strapped Chris on top of that 20 mil, and they took off again. So I don't know if those guys still living or can recall it. I would love to shake that pilot's hand.
Great story. Great story.
Yeah, unfortunately, Johan Mertz, who was an LO pilot at the time, was supposed to join us, but he hasn't arrived. It would have been quite interesting to hear his side of things, but that's the way it is, unfortunately. Tians?
Yes. My course and John met himself course together. He was also based at Peru at that time, so he was also involved in
very.
Yep. Sorry, Grant.
No. So I don't know if you experienced it, but the sound from Tians, I can hardly hear. It's very cut out.
It's very common for some reason.
Yeah, your comms are 1 out of 5, Tians. Typical chopper pilot.
Well, I can come in again. I reached them on a A52 or A53 on a very flat battery, and they spoke to me.
I'm joking, Paul. You know me, I joke about anything. My cup's always half empty, not half full.
No, that's good. We have to joke about these things. Listen, you come from. I just came from Auckland, so just to inform you, I went to visit my son.
You should have phoned me. You could have visited me, Paul.
No, you were here.
Yeah, passing the buck, eh? Listen, we've also got a couple more of Paul's platoon here. Marco Caforio is here. Marco was one of those that was casevac. Marco, do you want to give us some info?
Andrew, before that, can I just say I've got another appointment. Unfortunately, I've got to go. I want to say, Commandant Dippenaar, it's a pleasure seeing you again. All the guys, Gerard, I apologize if I offended you. Peter Williams, thanks for your input. Leon and Paul Tians, excellent. And Andrew, once again, you're doing a fantastic job. I really appreciate everything you do. Have a good day, guys. And
thanks,
we'll
Grant,
chat again.
and thanks for making the effort to join us.
Pleasure. Cheers, eh?
Sorry, Andrew, can I just have a quick word?
Yes, sure.
I think that chopper pilot Tians, he heard something about 14.5 or 23 mil. Then they lose signal very quickly, and you just hear the aircraft leaving in the middle distance. So maybe someone said something about 23 mil, and then he's gone.
Yeah, we'll try and get him back once the 23 mil's been shot out. Yeah.
Marco Caforio. Hello, how are you, my friend?
Unmute yourself, Marco.
I've
Well,
just
thanks. And
unmuted
yourself,
him.
Paul. Can you?
How's it, Marco?
Okay, and you? Fine, thanks, Andrew.
Yeah.
I was just listening
Good.
to the conversation, and it's so true what everyone says there, that if it wasn't for the leadership, we would have had more injuries and more people dying. And I just want to also say it was really well organized, and unfortunately, guys do die in that. But for the wounded, if it wasn't, as you guys say, the training and the leadership, we would have had more casualties. Just wanted to say that. And it's nice to hear the conversation. Really.
Thanks, Marco, and great to have you with us. And then also
Thank you.
from platoon B company platoon 1, we've also got Tora
Yes,
Hens here.
Yes.
Tora was in fact Paul Lowe's platoon sergeant.
Yeah, it was our
Tora,
sergeant.
yeah. I don't know, Tora, if you want him to have anything to say.
Hi, Andrew. Yeah, thanks. It's nice to hear from all the guys and all the different stories. Yeah, no, I don't have much to say. I mean, I gave up telling the story a long time ago because a lot of people don't. It's difficult to tell people what happened, and then people think you're just another guy, has been to the bush making up stories or whatever. So, but it's nice to hear. There's one thing, when we left Paul and them behind, sadly, we got to a point, and there were choppers there in the dark picking guys up also, if I'm not mistaken. Someone can verify that.
Maybe Terence, maybe let's see if we can hear you, if you'd like to come back on.
Can you hear?
Just trying to unmute him.
Jordan, while we wait for Tians, I just want to say you're looking great, and thank you for your input on the group. I know we've got a small smoke shell group, but your input is always very positive and yeah, highly technical sometimes, as you were in those days. I remember that you linked a tape recorder to our Radels intercom. So if we haven't spoken to anybody the moment you press your test box, then it cuts out the music, and you can talk to whoever is speaking to you, or vice versa. So, but thank you for you and your input. It's always a pleasure, really.
Thanks, Paul. Maybe Dippies, maybe you can just there are a couple of things that I'm sort of curious about. One is, once we sort of hit more trouble than anticipated, did the plans for the future operation change much?
In principle, yes, it did change, because we learned a lot from smoke shell from our own equipment. So the force itself was adjusted, and the equipment was also upgraded more for the bush type of warfare. That's equipment-wise. Then tactics and procedures was also adjusted. So I think to summarize it is to say that the smoke shell laid a very good foundation for the future, and on that foundation things was changed, adjusted, amended, improved, but in basic principles not much change. The role of mechanized force is still the same. And what we've learned is that control of mechanized forces is still the same and very critical. So yes, that's more or less what I can summarize. Even, you know, when the tanks was brought in at the end of the warfare in Angola, the tanks did not change much of the mechanized force procedures and drills. It just added quality to the firepower of the force. If there's somebody else that can add, he's welcome, but that's my contribution that I can make.
Thanks, Dippies. Just one other thing. At some stage, and I'm jumping a few days ahead now. At some stage, we went back to, I think, Ondangwa for maybe a night or two, and then came back into Angola. Was there a reason for that? Was that just to restock on supplies, or?
No, that was a very, very important operation that we've carried out. After Smoke Shell, and as you rightly say, we withdrew to Ondangwa. But while we were busy withdrawing, information of the enemy force at Zangongo came clear. And all of a sudden, there was a threat from Zangongo. You know, Zangongo was attacked the next year. I was also commanding that attack on Protea. That was the operation's name. But at Zangongo itself, there was a lot of movement of the enemy. And to be on the safe side, the powers to be decided that 6-1, the Smoke Shell force, move over to the west and prevent any excursions by the enemy from Zangongo. We moved in there, stayed there for a few days, and then withdrew. And that became, as you know correctly, a target the next year, Zangongo and Onjiva, with Operation Protea. If there's somebody else that knows about those operations, is welcome to add.
Okay, thanks. I didn't realize. So the withdrawal to Ondangwa was actually initially the withdrawal from the operation. And then there was a change of plan and we went back. You know, for us troops, it looked like we'd come down for a quick beer or two and then turned around and gone back. But yeah,
of course.
This is where these group conversations get so interesting. We just learn so much. Just for the legacy viewers out there, although I'm conducting this discussion in my capacity as a legacy presenter, I was also a Smoke Shell veteran. I was in A Company, Platoon 2. As we hit contact, our rifle hit a tree stump and broke its wishbone. And we spent a day and a half on the battlefield. We were shot at continuously. We were on our own until I think 8 o'clock that night, the first night, when a rifle from B Company joined us. So there were just basically two sections there. The ground was extremely hard. We never returned fire because we didn't want to give our position away. Ground was hard. We tried to dig trenches without making a noise. It was very difficult. About 2 o'clock in the morning, we heard movement, chains being pulled and things like that. At first light, we did a patrol. It turned out that these guys were no more than 200 meters away from us. And I think we eventually got out at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon of the 11th of June. So while we missed the action, we were at the receiving end of a lot of AK fire and just had to low. So just from my perspective, just to put it out there. Paul?
Andrew, yeah, you know what? I was there, but I wasn't there. I always say to people, you hear stories afterwards and you can't imagine. You were there, but this guy saw it from that side and that guy saw it from that side, and the angles differ. And everybody has got a story to tell, and we must tell those stories, definitely. I always say to people, coming back to Smoke Shell and the planning for Smoke Shell, was that Smoke Shell was a tactical HQ, and me and General Dippies had this discussion when we were sitting there around a fire one night, I believe, that one night when we had that presentation there. Smoke Shell was a tactical HQ of SWAPO. Now, all other from there on, all the other attacks were well-known bases that was attacked. So I believe that conventional warfare came into play much more than what we did. We fought, Smoke Shell, I believe, was a type of a bush war, fight, find and kill, seek and destroy type of operation, where it seems to me, and I might be wrong, and Dippies, you can rectify me if I'm wrong. The other officers from Protea and right through to Cuito Carnival, those were well-established bases that we knew where the enemy were. We could attack them with aeroplanes, with artillery, and eventually the ground troops and the mech move in and do the cleanup or whatever the case may be. Just a viewpoint from my side.
Thanks, Paul. I think if anyone else has got anything they would like to add or any questions they'd like to ask, let's do that. I see Tiens, I see you are back on. So if anyone wants to add anything, please feel free to do.
Andrew?
Yes, Peter.
I just wanted to say the operation was planned originally as a lightning attack on the SWAPO bases in southern Angola. The bases were slowly developing, coming further south. The guy in charge was a very great SWAPO commander. He was also at one stage in charge at Kasinga, and it was his idea to use the conventional Soviet doctrine of putting bases in and moving them further south. Those empty bases that the guys saw were bases that were put up, and then they would move further south and put a new base up, then move further south and put a new base up. So the idea of having these is that if you are in a base and you're attacked, you can always revert back to the previous base you were in, and you've already got stellings or positions that are already prepared. This whole thing was meant to go all the way south up to the border if necessary. And I think the South Africans realized there was a build-up and that the HQ was moving further south and further south. So it was unlike the other operations that took place like Protea and Meerbos and the other operations where we actually went in to do damage and hold ground. There was no chance of holding ground yet. It was a question of a speedy attack on the inside, disrupt and destroy their infrastructure, especially their headquarters, and then withdraw. So I think it was just the beginning stages of the South African war machine, and planning things is going on. Just like General Dippenaar said, that the training was very thorough, and I mean, they didn't change the tactics even after tanks got involved in Protea and at later operations and so on. So I think that the South Africans were very fortunate in that we got the right tactic right in the beginning. And I think the whole development of the Ratel was amazing, that they had the foresight to realize that we'd be involved with armor. And they wanted an infantry vehicle. Now, what's very funny about the Ratel and other armies of the world, I think that was the first army that had a weapon mounted on a vehicle and you had troops. Even today, the Americans don't use troops in an armored vehicle and then use them in conjunction, infantry and armored together.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Yeah, very interesting perspective. anyone got anything more to say? Leon, I don't know if you've got any questions possibly you'd like to ask.
Andrew, can I just say something? I think Peter alluded to the same thing earlier. I'm not sure if you were in that sort of, when we lined up to attack the Mahangu field, the armored cars, we were actually two lined up parallel and waiting to get our orders to move into this field. At that time, one of the Al-Ahed's gunships came and it was circling about, I would imagine about 400 feet, 500 feet, and it was shooting at a target to the west of us. And we were all standing out of the hedges, the infantry guys as well as our armored guys, and watching the spectacle. And as we were watching, and it was shooting in one direction, they started behind this Alouette, black smoke started appearing. So these guys were shooting back at the Alouette, trying to hit it out of the sky. And I don't think they knew that they were being shot at. And as they came around about the fourth or the fifth time, someone must have warned them. And this is actually funny. As this chopper came around, suddenly it realized this was in danger. It dove down, and the revs of the rotor went up, and it shot away there like a bat out of hell. It was actually funny the way they withdrew there. And they did that because they did not realize that they were being fired on. Anyways, that was what I wanted to say.
Thanks, Gerard.
Sorry.
Yeah,
Andrew?
Yes.
Just in conclusion, from my point of view, you know, we started with smoke shell and a particular pattern of mechanized force to do the attack. And at the end of the war, I think the count is 36 contacts or 36 battles by a mechanized force. And from the first to the 36th composition of the force, not much was changed. The basic principles remained the same. There was a mixture of mobile forces, whether it was tanks as at the end of the warfare or at the battles, or whether it was armored cars and mechanized forces. There was also always the mix of firepower on the ground, from the air, and by guns. And that's the basis that they are still planning today. If you think of our South African Defence Force, which is in shambles, they still work in that direction to have that kind of combination of forces. And I think we can be proud to say that we were part of the, what they say, the Hoeksteen, the stone that started the building of mechanized warfare. We were there That's all I want to say.
Okay, thanks, Dippy. Leon de Bruin wants to ask a couple of questions. Leon?
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Andrew. And if I may just say hello to everybody there. Hello, Gerard. Lovely to see you guys again. Paul, nice to see you. Marco, my friend from the SCOA skis. Yeah, and then HP, you're looking great, buddy. You just epitomize the spirit of the South African soldiers of our era. So yeah, great hello to you. And General Dippy's great to see you again. I know you had a rough time while we were up on the Angolan tour 2 years ago. So hope you've found peace and getting on with life. Yeah, so just for those who don't know me, I'm not 6'1" at all. I'm wearing this t-shirt today in solidarity with you guys today because I knew I was going to be on this video call. I have a few comments just to make. Sorry, I was an infantry platoon commander. I was deployed to 5-4 Battalion, specifically Ilundu and Ianana. There's a few points that I would like to make. The first thing, Gerard, you made reference to it, and you said that you ended up right next to a trench and you didn't see it. If you guys remember our tour, and we were at Kahama where Fidel Castro visited that bunker base over there. That was my second visit to that base, the first one in 2019. And on both occasions, I walked around very carefully and I scrutinized how visible that base would have been from either the land or the air. And even the air holes were under trees or bushes, and the entrances were under trees. There is absolutely no way that you would know that there was a base there at all. The only things that you'll be able to see are the footpaths that lead into it. So, Gerard, I fully understand that you would stop 3 meters from a bunker and not see it at all, really. Yeah, and then, you know, I have a very healthy respect for Tiens, you guys. I was in the infantry. I had a lot of respect for your Puma pilots and specifically your Alouette pilots. I think they did a great job there. And it's really special for me to be part of the 6-1 guys. I find it to be a sort of a surrogate home for this infantry guy on the outside there. And I just love being part of it. So, yeah, thank you very much for inviting me, Andrew. And to you guys, heaps of respect. And I just love listening to your stories. Thank you so much. Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks, Leon.
Andrew.
It's good to have you. Yes.
Andrew, I just want to say it to each and every one on this exercise. It was nice seeing you all. It's nice to hear your approach to what has happened and the memories that you carry with you. Thank you guys for being veterans and proud veterans of the mechanized force, whether it's mechanized or air, that work together. It was great seeing you all. And thanks, Andrew, for your initiative to get us together. If you will excuse me, I will now want to withdraw.
Okay. Thanks, Dippy. Thanks for joining us and thanks for the input. It was good having you.
Can I come in quickly?
Yes.
Andrew, before the piece left now, I just want to say to all of the guys, thanks for making a huge impact in my life, every one of you. And on this stage of my life, I can just say to the guys, each of us must help another soldier, talking with him, discussing stuff, because we're getting old and the memories start to come back, and as we grow older, we have to do the skouerskis more and let the guys talk their hearts out, because they have to do it, and there's a lot of people still behind the scenes is troubling himself, and so we must try to help the other guys. And so thanks for all the people involved in this type of discussions. So for the legacy also, Andrew, thanks. And on Dippies, jy ken my, jy's my oom en my pa en in alle opsigte, soos julle almal ken as boetas. Ja, ons vat hierdie ding wel by die horings en ons kom by mekaar, so maklik, so moeilik wat dit is, maar probeer om iemand te help. Dankie daarvoor.
Thanks, HP. Just for the legacy viewers out there that may not know HP's story, HP was the driver of Paul Lowe's Ratel. the rifle was shot out. He managed to get out and was shot through the stomach by a 14.5 anti-aircraft round at point blank range. He still has a huge hole in his back. He spent 3 years at 1 mil, has had 100 operations since, and still suffers the after effects of that battle. He really is a fantastic testimony to a real brave man. And his wife, Fia, is awesome. She's a nurse. She's looked after him for the last 40 odd years. And really, HP, it's great to have you here. Great man. Thank you.
Andrew, if I may come in from the Air Force side, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah. To everyone who participated today, I would also like to thank you very much. And I know the one comment was, yeah, like the chopper guys, my voice was not good at the time. That was all the nice part of exchanging and pulling ones, and excuse me if I say this, taking the mickey out of each other, if I use that expression now, eintlik Afrikaans, so if I use it in the wrong context, excuse me. But that's the part where all the gears working together with you people was such a fantastic experience, which cannot be elaborated well, it can be elaborated more on, but it cannot be eliminated. That was the spirit that we had, which was fantastic. And I must comment, although we were only on the Puma side, never fighting as such, because we were not armed except for the troops that were on board with us. But the Alouette guys, and I had my 3 years experience in fighting with the Alouette, flying in various things there as well. That gave me the perspective of what the Alouettes had to go through, even though, and like I say, Johan Mertz, who was with me at Rundu at the time, Deeren Smokeshell was involved somewhere with that battle as well. And it was a pity, because Johan and myself keep in touch with each other. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. This was a very good experience.
Thanks, Tiens. Thanks for joining us. I think what we've tried to do is have these group interviews about specific operations, because I think we 6-1 get the credit for Operation Skeptic or Smokeshell, but there are so many other spokes in the wheel that played a role, and the Tiffies, for example. Unfortunately, we haven't managed to get any onto these interviews yet, but they played a huge role. The Air Force, the medics. Unfortunately, Dr. Loubser, Andrew Loubser, was supposed to join us today, but something cropped up and he had to pull out. But that again would have given such another perspective. So yeah, it's I think it's the way to go. Let's put it out there as a group, and people hear different perspectives of the same battle, be it from ground forces, be it from recce's, be it from the air. I just think it just adds such a different dynamic. But thanks for joining us. Anyone else want anything to say?
Yeah, Andrew, I just want to say, lastly, I think that is what made 6-1 Mechanized Battalion such a good force. The first thing is, I think people didn't realize it. Like, for instance, the Air Force and some of the recce's, the Parabats, for that operation, they were dealt off to 6-1. They were part of 6-1. They didn't even know it. That's what I want. There were even a Navy guy that was dealt off to 6-1 during that time throughout the orders. There was a Navy guy. We always thought, what is the Navy guy doing here? But he was firstly observing, secondly, most probably a permanent force guy, observing, learning, and see what's happening with the planning of such a big operation. And then lastly, Leon, thank you for your input, but your input on Facebook and on WhatsApp it's always nice reading your stories. You know, we were very much excluded from what else happened in all of Namibia or Southwest Africa in those days. And you guys were the foot soldiers, the Boetfits on the ground that was fighting another war that we weren't a bigger part of. So keep on doing that, and thanks for being here and being a supporter of 6-1 Mech. And then, Andrew, lastly, as you said that night to me, that the next morning you said, I can't remember your words, just recall the spooker.
The demons.
Demons.
Yeah, the demons were busy with me on that night, and they were. The demons were very much busy with me on that second night on the target area. But there's still a demon lying in my house, and the demon it's an ammo bag full of letters of those 12 guys of mine that died. And I opened one letter one day, and I said to myself, no, I just close it immediately. And I want to go to one of these meetings of ours. I don't know if I can go to Gariep, maybe in Bloem, or wherever where we get together and there's a few smoke shell guys. I want each of us taking a letter out there and reading it to the guys, you know, and see what was those guys' last requests, their last, you know, feelings, their last ideas, what went through their heads before they went into this operation. So that is also one of my demons still lying with me.
Yeah. Just to put what Paul said into perspective, we slept in July 2022. We slept on the battlefield at Smoke Shell, and I was fairly close to where Paul was sleeping, and he tossed and turned all night. And then at 5 o'clock in the morning, a shot was fired in the nearby township, and Paul fell through his stretcher. And it was just, it seems funny, but at the time, Paul was battling so much. It was like a terrible night for him. Paul has lived with this, losing 12 men for the last 44 years. I think as tough as things have been for HP, from a medical perspective, I think from a psychological perspective, Paul has gone through hell. And Paul, you're doing exceptionally well. As I said to you at the time, if it wasn't for your actions on that day, a lot more than 12 guys would have been killed. So I think there are a lot of guys still around today, thanks to your actions.
Thanks, Andrew. Andrew, much appreciated.
Oh. Okay, guys, if no one else wants to add anything, shall we call it a day?
Andrew, I just want to say, keep on what you're doing, guy. You're doing great. Thank you. Yeah, send our regards to Koos and all the guys from Legacy. I believe they're doing a good job finding these stories and be told. It must be told to the rest of the world.
Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, guys, for being present. Peter, all you guys, Leon, HP, yeah, Gerard, dankie julle, hoor.
Thanks to all, and to the Legacy viewers out there. I think you're going to really enjoy this one. I think it's one of the best. Certainly in this new experience of group interviews, I think it's been the best so far. This is the third one I've done. The previous two were 3-2 operations. And until we meet again, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank
Thanks,
you, guys.
everyone.
Thank you,
Keep
everyone.
well.
Take care.
Bye.
Cheers.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, James. Special to have you as well.